Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to the Audubon Naturalist Society's April Conservation Café with our incredibly special guest Vernice Miller-Travis. My name is Eliza Cava and I'm the Director of Conservation for Audubon Naturalist Society, which we call ANS. ANS is the oldest independent environmental organization in the DC area. We're headquartered in Chevy Chase, Maryland at our historic Wood End Nature Sanctuary, and we serve the whole DC, Maryland, and Virginia region. Our Conservation Cafés is a monthly lecture series that we run with fantastic speakers just like Vernice, and normally we host these events at our headquarters in Chevy Chase, and of course they're attended by a group in person, up to about 40 people. In these extraordinary times, we're online, we're in Zoom tonight, and there are so many more of you than there normally would be, so thank you for coming, thank you for joining us. Thank you to Vernice for your flexibility. And we're just so excited that we can bring her words to a much broader audience than usual, plus in the recording, which will live on. So thank you again so much. A little bit more about Audubon Naturalist Society. We have a conservation program, an education program, and we work to restore our sanctuary. And we actually have another sanctuary as well, Russ Nature Sanctuary in Leesburg, Virginia, and Loudoun County. We do an enormous amount of work in schools with environmental education programs, teaching adults about natural history, and doing advocacy, policy, and community outreach around conservation issues. With the coronavirus crisis, of course, everything is different. We are all working from home. We hope that you and your families are staying safe. And thank you for taking the time to be with us during this hard time. Vernice is an incredibly dynamic speaker, and I think you will feel like she is right there with you in your living room or your bedroom or wherever you're watching this cafe. So I'm really excited to be able to bring this to you. And this is now our second fully virtual Conservation Cafe event. So as I mentioned, we will be recording the event and circulating the link to registered attendees, both those who are attending in person and those who registered for the recording only link, as soon as possible afterwards. We really thank you for your donations making this event possible, and we'll continue to ask for donations for 30 days post-event for new people to view the recording. After that, after 30 days, the recording will be available free to watch. Those of you who are here live, I'll be sharing some instructions with you for how to participate in the chat, but we'll cut those out of this for the recording. And finally, let me go ahead and introduce Vernice. Vernice is, for those of you who have not gotten the chance to know her or to know her work, for the past 30 plus years, Vernice Miller-Travis has worked to help build the field of environmental justice and grow and shape the environmental justice movement across the United States. She's a real hero and a real inspiration of mine, and I know many, many others. Her biography and her history really take us through the last 30 years of the environmental justice movement, from before the first People's Gathering for Environmental Justice, which she'll tell us about later. She's one of the nation's leading experts, pioneers, and most respected thought leaders on the topic. She's a skilled practitioner in multicultural engagement and organizational development, with expertise in clean air and water, regulatory systems, and environmental and urban planning. She consults with the federal and state agencies, foundations, and nonprofits now, with the Metropolitan Group. Before she was a consultant, she established the Environmental Justice Program for NRDC. She initiated the Environmental Justice Grant-Making Portfolio for the Ford Foundation. She has worked with communities throughout the country, particularly in New York City and also in the Washington, D.C. area. She co-founded We Act for Environmental Justice and serves on the boards of a long list of both mainstream and environmental justice or civil rights organizations, including We Act, Clean Water Action, Land Loss Prevention Project, Natural Resource Defense Council's Action Fund, Patuxent Riverkeeper, and on the advisory boards of the Chesapeake Bay Trust, Green Leadership Trust, Imani Energy, and the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum here in Washington, D.C. In addition to her incredible expertise, she's a fantastic speaker, and I'm really excited to hear you speak, and I'm really lucky that we at Audubon Naturalist Society have had the opportunity to get to know her. She's been an honoree at our conferences, Taking Nature Black, and she's been both an informal and a formal advisor to us, and we're just, as I said, so honored and so lucky to be able to speak with her and to have invited her to come and speak with you all. And there are really a lot of you. As I said, we sold out of our live tickets, and and we have 60 plus 70 people on right now. So here you all are. Welcome, and enjoy the evening. Those of you who are here live, you'll be able to share your questions with us through the chat and the Q&A boxes. And those of you watching the recording, you'll be able to hear through the course of the evening how those got to be, how those questions were given to Vernice. So thank you all again, and enjoy.
The reasons we have such a big audience is because we've got nowhere to go. So we might as well do this together, right? But thank you, truly. When Eliza first asked me to do this presentation tonight, I want to say it was probably about 5 months ago. And, you know, our focus was commemorating and celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which is this Earth Day, 2020, is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And we started talking about sort of looking back and reflecting on those early Earth Days, and who was in the circle and who was out of the circle. And then some of us got together and built a new circle called Environmental Justice. What it was like to be so close by when the first Earth Day happened. Granted, I was only 11 years old at the time, but I lived in the neighborhood that was adjacent to Central Park, the northern edge of Central Park. When I was growing up in New York City and Harlem, in the Harlem community, the village of Harlem, the northern part of Central Park was not well maintained. In fact, it was a wild area, not well maintained, lots of overgrowth. The playgrounds there were not well maintained because they didn't really think of the northern part of Central Park as part of the treasure of Central Park, because it was surrounded by a community that was overwhelmingly African American and Latino. And so we never, at least I never, thought of Central Park as my park. I loved a park called St. Nicholas Avenue Park, which was a short walking distance from my house on Lenox Avenue, now known as Malcolm X Boulevard. My favorite park in New York was Riverside Park, which abutted the Hudson River on the west side of Harlem, where the struggle to launch West Harlem Environmental Action was fought. But we never thought about Central Park as our park. And so it's not surprising to me, but I would often think when I'd look at the history of Earth Day and that first Earth Day and all the great things people wrote about it, and the people who came to talk, and people came from far and near, and 100,000 people gathered, and then they marched from Central Park down to Union Square. And I would always say, wow, that was a really great event. Where did that happen? Because it certainly didn't happen in the neighborhood where I lived. And I lived adjacent to Central Park. I lived about 1.5 miles from Central Park. And if you just walk down the street that I lived on, Lenox Avenue, you would get right smack at Central Park at 110th Street. So I often wondered, how come nobody reached out to us? Now, granted, I was 11, you know, take that with a grain of salt. But it's often like the events that happen in Washington, D.C., when major gatherings happen and major demonstrations, with the exception of the March on Washington and the Million Man March. There's very little interaction that goes on with those major mobilizations and the folks who live in that city or in that town, particularly the folks of color. And that would go on and on and on as Earth Day continued to grow and to spread and to become a phenomenon in this country. One thing that wasn't a part of the phenomena was the presence of people of color, or the issues, the environmental issues that we were challenged by. And that would express itself in a variety of ways, not just around Earth Day, but about the whole evolution of the conservation and environmental movement. A lot of people were left out of that conversation, a lot of people. And as I would begin to do my own work as a researcher with the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, where I helped to, was a contributing author and helped to publish and produce the landmark report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, it became so very clear to me that there was a whole other conversation happening, a whole other set of realities around environment and natural resources and public health, and who benefits, who does not, who gets to experience the great, wonderful outdoors and nature in our country, and who never gets to benefit from that. And that was brought home so clearly to me when I had the privilege to work on toxic waste and race. And so what I was looking at in toxic waste and race, we had a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was this: is there a correlation between the national priorities list. That is the list that US EPA keeps of the most hazardous waste sites in the United States, those that are thought to pose imminent threat to human health and the environment. They keep a list of those sites, and they make their way through that list over time to get contractors and engineers and folks out to clean up those sites. Was there a relationship between where those sites were located, the residential zip codes in which those sites could be found, and the demographic and racial composition of the people who lived in those zip codes where those hazardous waste sites were found? So that was our hypothesis. We drilled down, we looked at about 120 different variables. We had an independent firm that was running data sets for us and doing the statistical analysis. And then all that data came back, and it was my job to integrate that data. It was Charles Lee's job. If hopefully you all know who Charles Lee is. There is a lot of talk around the country about the father of environmental justice. The actual father of environmental justice is a man named Charles Lee. And Charles was the research director at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. And I went to work for Charles as his assistant. And Charles had, what caused them to want to do this research is that many churches, many local churches in South Carolina and North Carolina, members of the United Church of Christ, were calling up to headquarters, which at that time was in New York, and saying, our county government, our state government, private sector folks are building hazardous waste incinerators, hazardous waste landfills, all kinds of environmental threats in people's communities with no public accountability, no discussion, no public hearings, no anything. The first thing most people knew that these land uses were planned in their communities is when the bulldozers showed up to clear the trees and begin to make these landfills or to build the infrastructure for these facilities. And so the churches called up to the national church and said, is there anything you can do to help us get a handle on what's going on and to figure out how we might be able to push back so that the folks who live in the places where we live have a choice about what they live next to and what ultimately is going to impact the quality of their lives and their families. And so we start doing this data. Charles conceives this research report. Reverend Ben Chavis was our deputy director at the time and became our director. The great civil rights leader, Reverend Dr. Charles Cobb from right here in the DMV from DC was our executive director. And they all said, this is a great thing to do, let's look at it. And so then I came in about a year later to start drilling down on this research. And when we finished compiling all the data, one thing jumped out at me. Well, several things jumped out at me, but I was a poli-sci major in college and was on my way to law school to be a civil rights attorney, and thought I had looked at every possible combination of issues of racial discrimination and public policy, but it never occurred to me that toxics and race would have any kind of intersection. And so as we're running through the data sets and we're looking at all different kinds of correlations, race proved to be the most statistically significant indicator and where those hazardous waste sites were located by orders of magnitude, far and away, completely independent from issues of class, level of educational attainment, all kinds of things. Eliza, you have a question.
Yes, I was wondering if at this point you might want to run our poll question and get a sense from our participants to what extent they were aware of some of these issues.
Let's do it.
All right, so can Greg, behind the scenes, Greg Wizard, can you run poll question number 2, please? It's actually the next question. I'm going to end that one. Send you to the next question, which you can get with the drop-down menu. There we go. So go ahead and just give us a sense of your baseline of awareness.
So the question is, hopefully you all can see it. Were you aware that African American, Indigenous, and other communities of color were experiencing tremendous disparities in air quality and health disparities before the current pandemic?
We're getting 100% on yes. This is a very well-informed audience.
Okay. Well, I have to say, when we started, when I joined the UCC Commission for Racial Justice to undertake this research, I was not aware of this issue at all. This just caught me completely by surprise. And though it was the foundation of our hypothesis, you didn't expect it. Look at that, 100%. Yay. You didn't expect the data to come back as startlingly clear as it was. And one of the things that I deduced from the research, because it was my job to sort of run all that data and then map that data before the advent of GIS, I might add. I created those maps. If you've ever seen the report Toxic Waste and Race, there's a beautiful cream and red map on the cover that shows the correlation between where people of color are and where these hazardous waste sites are. I made that map by hand. And then I gave it to a friend of mine who was a graphic artist, and she reproduced the map that I created. But we did not expect the correlations to come back as strongly as they did. And so one of the things that I deduced from that, and I would say it was my greatest intellectual contribution to toxic waste and race. I drilled down in my psyche and remembered something from the one class in college that almost killed me, statistics, the class I came the closest to failing. That kind of statistical correlation shows that whatever that phenomena is that you're looking at, it is not random. And that was a powerful, powerful, powerful understanding and piercing of that data, that it was not some random set of circumstances that had these hazardous waste sites be sited, be built, be operated over decades in places where people of color lived. It was an intentional act, an intentional decision done by the local land use authorities, which was really usually county and municipal government. The states had to approve that, and EPA itself had to approve that for all the sites that were built once EPA came online. And it was that piece of data and that correlation of information that really changed the course of my life. So I thought I was going to law school. I had always wanted to be a civil rights attorney. That had been my dream since I was in the 9th grade. And once I was there and was able to do this research, I decided that what I really needed to do was figure out what this intersection is between civil rights and racial justice and environment. That this is a new, at the time, this is 1986 and 1987, this is a new space within the civil rights space. There are not a lot of people in this space. There's not a lot of data in this space. And we need to build out this space. And why is that? Because it's interesting, because it's curious, because it's something that nobody else is doing? No. The reason we needed to fill out this space and really grow this space was because as we began to look more and more and more at these correlations, we also found elevated levels of disease, elevated levels of premature morbidity and mortality, and elevated levels of death, premature death in the communities where these sites were located. And so at the same time that I was working on that report, some friends who I had worked with on a presidential campaign for Jesse Jackson, let me just say, so people can get context and say, oh my goodness, Vernice is so old. She worked on the Jesse Jackson campaign. Yes, I did. The second one, not the first one, if that makes any difference. And a friend of mine who I'd worked with on the campaign, the 88 campaign, she said to me, you know, some folks up in Harlem where you live are building this independent democratic organization. And I think you might be interested. And I said, you know, I don't really want any parts of Democratic Party politics in New York. Yeah, really no. And she said, no, I think you might like this. And so I hemmed and I hawed, and I finally went to a meeting one night, straight from my office at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. I come home, I go to this meeting. I don't even go home. I go to this meeting, and I walk in the meeting, and folks are talking about the North River sewage treatment plant. And it took me about 30 seconds to say, oh my God, right here where I live, in the place where I live, they're struggling with this very issue. It might not be hazardous waste sites that they're talking about, but certainly this phenomena around land uses or unwanted land uses placed in close proximity to where people of color live that transform the fundamental quality of life of those communities is happening right here where I live. How could you not have seen that? So I tell you this to say this one thing. A lot of people say that there is willful cognition on the part of some folk to ignore what's happening in communities of color, to ignore what's happening in low-income communities, to ignore what's happening in indigenous communities. And I would say sometimes there is a willful attempt to ignore, out of sight, out of mind, what's happening in those communities. But a lot of times we are not paying attention to the relationship between the built environment, the natural environment, and how they impact human health and how they impact some communities more than they impact others. That was true for me. So I want to say to you, you know, if you're ever in a conversation and somebody says, you just don't care about these people, Most of us don't see this unless it's happening in your backyard. In my case, it was my front yard, and I still didn't see it. And so then I began to join forces with some folks in my Rainbow Coalition in the House, who I'm loving it. Then I decided to join forces with my neighbors who were part of this coalition, this burgeoning community coalition. And we would go on to organize and mobilize, knock on doors, leaflet, go in stores, go in barbershops, go in beauty shops, go to churches and speak at churches. I'd say there's about 15,000 units of public housing in this community that's adjacent to the North River Sewage Treatment Plant. And my colleague and friend and partner, Peggy Shepard, and I knocked on every single door in public housing. We knocked on every door in the tenements in our communities. We knocked on every door in the brownstones in the apartment buildings. We left no stone unturned because we wanted people to know what was happening in our community, but we also wanted them to come out and be engaged. And what we found out in mobilizing and in having public meetings that went on for about 4 years before we created our nonprofit, We Act for Environmental Justice, we found out that there was a tremendous degree of asthma, household asthma, in virtually every household in our community. And it was startling to Peggy and I. We had no idea. And so then we began to do some research around that with the Mailman School of Public Health via a friend of mine from college. So I went to Barnet in Columbia, which is also in the West Harlem community. They will tell you that they're in a place called Morningside Heights. Morningside Heights is a neighborhood in Harlem. Let's just be clear. It's on 116th Street and Broadway. And no matter how you slice it, 116th Street is in Harlem, no matter what the university likes to say. But a friend of mine, a classmate of mine, he was about three classes ahead of me. And Jean went on to go to medical school when he graduated from Columbia College. He went to the College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia, and then he went to work in a pulmonary medicine clinic at Harlem Hospital. So Harlem Hospital is an important institution in Harlem. It's the largest employer in the Harlem community. It is the singular and most noteworthy public medical institution there. It's also the place where both of my parents worked, my dad for 35 years, my mother for 43 years, my dad as an administrative clerk, my mother as a nurse. And it's also the place where I was born. And so Jean decided he could have gone anywhere with his degree from the College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia, but he decided to teach at Harlem Hospital and to practice at Harlem Hospital. So I reached out to Jean when we started to hear about all the asthma in every household, and I asked him, what is going on? Can you help us gain some context and some understanding for what's happening here? And he said to me, well, it's curious that you are asking me this, Vernice. And I said, why? He said, because we just applied to the National Institutes of Health for a research grant to look at and document the presence of household asthma in the Harlem community. And I said, well, what made you do that? He said, because we are getting so many admissions through both pediatric admissions and adult admissions at Harlem Hospital through the emergency room for asthma, people in crises, every age group, everyone. It seems that every household in Northern Manhattan has asthma or someone who has asthma. And we want to try to get a grip on characterizing what that is. And I said, well, if you can open up your sample and include some of the households in West Harlem, that is the part of Harlem that abuts the Hudson River, you might get even more data because all of the polluting sources are over there where we live. So he did that. We built this partnership with Columbia University, a partnership that has been ongoing for about 20 years in terms of research. And what we found was more startling than what I found through toxic waste and races research. What we found was that our community had the highest incidence of asthma in the Western Hemisphere. Now let that sink in for a minute, because where else is in the Western Hemisphere, right? Mexico City is in the Western Hemisphere. And Mexico City has god-awful air quality, so it's pretty good these days. And that's temporary. There's lots of other places, there's lots of other cities, but for some reason, our community had the highest incidence of asthma in the United States. We also had the highest rate of premature death from asthma in the United States. And our numbers were so astronomically high that if you removed our numbers from the national average in the United States, the overall incidence of asthma would have dropped precipitously. And that's how big the numbers were in our community. And that was just mind-boggling. We had no idea. We stumbled into this. And then we began to look at, again with Columbia, we began to look at what were the sources of pollution. It turns out it was particulate pollution. And I said, come back to this issue a little later in my comments, because yesterday EPA took a major action about the particulate standard and the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And so I want to come back to this issue a little later because it's still very live. So we began to realize that we lived in a place that had an enormous environmental burden. And that environmental burden was not just making the air unpleasant or foul, it was killing us. And that's when I decided, okay, we really have got to put all of our efforts, all of our intellectual strength, all of our focus and attention on what is happening to our communities in terms of environmental threats, and what is it costing us in terms of our morbidity and mortality, our health, our well-being, our children's ability to function and thrive in school. What is happening? And at the same time that we were doing that work, communities all over the United States were starting to do that work. But I will say that when Peggy and I and Chuck Sutton and many of our other neighbors in Northern Manhattan and in West Harlem began to do this work, we thought it was just us. We thought it was only happening to us. We didn't even know that there were communities in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is one of the 5 counties in New York City. We didn't even know it was happening to folks in Brooklyn. We didn't know it was happening to folks in the Bronx. You could walk from where we live to the Bronx. We did not know that it was happening not only all over our city, it was happening all over our region, it was happening all over our country. And we wouldn't know that until we were invited again. The United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice decided to step up and create an event and a conference and a gathering called the First National People Environmental Leadership Summit. That took place at the Washington Court Hotel in DC in October of 1991, October 24th to October 27th, 1991. And about 700 people showed up at that conference. And I'll never forget when Peggy and I walked in the door, we walked through registration, we walk in the ballroom, and we see all these people who had come from everywhere around the country. They had come from the Marshall Islands. They had come from Puerto Rico. They had come from some African nations, but they had come from every corner of the United States of America. They had come from Hawaii. They had come from everywhere. And everybody was facing some degree of challenge as we were. And I remember looking at Peggy and Peggy looking at me and our eyes filling up with tears because we realized that we were not alone. And for all that time, we thought it was just us. So the lesson here is it's never just you, right? There's always other people in struggle, and you have to look for those people to build community. And we built community, and that community is still hanging tough today. So 1991 to how many years is that? 30 something years? 30 years. 30. Almost 30 years. So, and all those people, not all of them. So the other sad thing about our work is that so many of the people that we gathered with at that conference have died, not because they were old, not because they were elderly, but because they had different diseases, different conditions, because of their environmental exposures that took them from this earth much earlier than they should have left here. In our own community, we went to funerals so often, and that's one of the points of demarcation in environmental justice communities, the number of funerals that you go to. There was a group in Gainesville, Florida, the Newtown Florist Club. And the Newtown Florist Club, in the Black community, you used to have these groups called funeral societies. And funeral societies would help put on funerals for people who couldn't afford to do their own funeral, but they would always do the flowers for the funerals. And the Newtown Florist Club found that they were doing so many funerals in their community. It was just off the charts. And they were like, something is amiss here. And so they began to look and discover that, lo and behold, they had these hazardous waste sites. And these hazardous waste sites had been leaching into the groundwater, and people had been drinking contaminated water for God knows how long. And they believed that there was a strong correlation between that and the number of premature deaths that were happening in their community. And they stumbled across that because they were doing so many flower arrangements and floral arrangements for so many funerals of so many people in their community. So we came out of that First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit and decided that we would do a couple things. First, we wrote the principles of environmental justice at that conference. that's sort of the foundation, the Bible of the environmental justice movement. And I'm so privileged to say that I was asked to be one of the 10 people on that drafting committee that wrote the principles of environmental justice. And it's a defining moment in my life. So last year I was at a conference, and these young people at the conference decided that they wanted to rewrite the principles of environmental justice. And I almost lost my mind. I was like, yeah, no. No, you can't update them. No, you can't fix the grammar, though God knows I wish I could. You can't touch that, right? Because it is what it is. Now, at the time, I remember saying to the audience, we would do drafts of the principles, and we would come back after dinner, the drafting committee, and we would wordsmith the entire 17 principles of environmental justice with 700 people. It was the most extraordinary democratic process I'd ever participated from then until now. And I kept saying to folks, you know, don't get yourself in a twist. We'll come back at some point and we'll fix it. If it's not right, we'll come back and we'll fix it. And I remember a friend of mine said, she got up, she's from North Carolina, Black Workers for Social Justice was her organization. And she said, Leah Weiss, and she said, we're not coming back to fix this, okay? So either we get it right now or we don't get it, because we're never coming back to fix this. And I said, oh, Leah, you're wrong, we'll be back. She was right, I was wrong. And then when I heard these young people last year saying they wanted to take another crack at it, I was like, yeah, no. So a sense of ownership, right? When you are there to build something, whether it's a community-based organization, whether it's a campaign with your neighbors, whether it's a cleanup campaign, a save a stream campaign, whatever it is, when you are bound to that process with folks, you will always be bound to those people, and you will always be bound to that work. And so, though I've gone on to do a lot of other things across my life, these 30 plus years, that work remains seminal for me, both that work with the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice and that work building We Act for Environmental Justice. So in 1988, we decided to create a nonprofit organization. At the time, it was called West Harlem Environmental Action, to really try and get a grip on what was happening to our community and what could we do to intervene and to intercede, to lower the rates of asthma. What could we do to work with the city of New York, the state of New York, EPA Region 2, to really get a handle on the overwhelming level of particulate pollution in our community? What could we do?
Vernice?
Yes.
Can I, before we go back into particulate pollution and
Yes.
And We Act, can I actually ask you to circle back to a different comparison?
Sure.
That is on our theme. So you just described so eloquently the process of being at the People's Summit, and that was the year after the Earth Day where you were asked to speak as the founders of the new We Act with Peggy Shepard. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what that first Earth Day with the mainstream environmental, your first speaking Earth Day with the mainstream environmental movement was like.
Yeah,
and
so,
especially since you can give it as a compare and contrast
sure.
to the People's Summit.
So it was fun. I want to say it was fun because I was in the green room. I was on the stage, right? I was a special person. I wasn't out there with the hoi polloi. So that picture that you see on the screen, the picture to your left, I call that the Peggy butt picture. I don't know if Peggy knows I call that the Peggy butt picture, but I do. This is a picture I took of my partner, Peggy Shepard, as she was addressing the crowd. And you can't see the definition of the crowd, but it goes on forever. So there's probably about 200,000 people there in the Great Lawn of Central Park. And as Peggy was speaking, I was standing right behind her, and I took this picture over her shoulder at the audience. Again, New York City is a very diverse city. The areas around Central Park, at least the northern part of Central Park, is still a majority person of color people, a majority people of color community. But I probably could count the number of people of color in that audience of 200,000 people. I could count them on two hands. I'm sure I could. And most of them were standing on the stage, because that picture in the middle has got three of them: myself, Cesar Chavez, and Peggy Shepard. But it was fun. It was really a great day. One of the things I loved about this event is you see all those people out there. When the event was over, there was not one piece of trash left in the park. They cleaned up after themselves, which is so highly unusual. But environmentalists out to support Earth Day, we took that message seriously, right? That we didn't want to leave the park dirtier than we found it. people received us well. The camaraderie behind the stage was real. There were a lot of people that I knew from progressive politics in New York who were part of it. It was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day. The only challenge was that I wish the people that I spent every day with in West Harlem had been there at Earth Day with me. They were not. I wish the people who were building movement in Brooklyn had been there, or the folks who were throwing down in the South Bronx around environmental issues. I wish they had been there with me that day, but they were not. And hence
do
why—
you think that that has started to change? Is that changing today?
Well, you know, so the last Earth Day event I went to was a wonderful event at on the National Mall in DC. And there it was more diverse in terms of the speakers, but again, the audience was not as diverse as it could have been, considering we were in Chocolate City. And you know, you just have to keep asking yourself, what is it that we're not doing that we could be doing to create a movement where we're all truly in and at the barricades together? I think one of the most extraordinary events I've seen was the People's Climate March 3 years ago. Adrian, Dr. A, remind me what year that was. At the time, Dr. Adrian Hollis worked for We Act for Environmental Justice. She was the director of our Office of Federal Policy in DC, and Adrian mobilized the Environmental Justice and Climate Forum and a lot of other people to participate in the People's Climate March. And it was an extraordinary event for this reason. All these years, 30 plus years, I've been trying to get the mainstream community and the environmental justice community in one common conversation, really moving, building power as one base. And it's been challenging over the years. That has not always happened, but for the People's Climate March, I don't know what it was, I don't know why it was, but we seem to have really broken through that day. And so, as you all may remember, folks who are here in the DC area or here on the East Coast, it was an unbelievably hot day, that Earth Day. It was unbelievably hot. It was in the 90s, which is, you know, even for DC, which is unusual in April, right? And so we're marching along, and I'm standing next to Adrian as we're marching along, and we're near the front of the march. And Adrian keeps saying to me, "Vernice, are you feeling okay?" And I was like, "I feel fine. I'm having the time of my life. This is like the greatest thing since ever," right? And she just kept asking me whether I was feeling okay, and I really did feel fine. And we got to a certain point, and Adrian said, "I think you need to sit down." I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because you are red as a beet. You are having heat stroke." So Adrian is an actual doctor, right? Not a medical doctor, but she knows enough to know that I was having heat stroke. And she said, "You need to go and sit down." And she kept telling me. So after we did this action in front of the White House, I went and sat down on the side as the contingent that we were in marched on to the mall and did the final part of the People's Climate March. So while I was sitting there, I just watched all these people walk by, right? I watched Local 32 BJ, that's the janitors union from SEIU out of New York City. I watched the National Nurses Association walk by. I watched SEIU walk by. I watched student groups walk by. I watched historically Black colleges and universities walk by. I never did get to see my colleagues and friends from the environmental movement because they were all the way back at the Capitol. By the time we got to the National Mall, they were still back at the Capitol. They hadn't left yet. That's how many people were out there. But everybody was out there, and everybody was out there together, finally realizing that our common humanity, our very existence, was really up for grabs, and that we all needed to step forward. And so I felt an enormous sense of joy, an enormous sense of pleasure, and that maybe climate and the threat of global climate change is the thing that makes us see how intimately connected we all are to each other. It was a glorious thing. And if I hadn't had heat stroke, and if Adrian hadn't sat me down on the corner, I never would have seen all of that because all those people were behind us. And it was an extraordinary thing. And I think we're in another moment where people are recognizing our common humanity. And isn't it a shame that it's taken a global pandemic for us to all understand that we truly are interconnected? The folks in Wuhan province are connected to the people in the DMV, are connected to the people in Canada, are connected to the people in Greenland, are connected to the people in the UK, are connected to people all over the world, that we are truly interconnected. And we've been saying this as environmentalists forever. This is always been something that we've talked about. It's been foundational in the things that we have shared, and the narrative that we've tried to drive is that you have to care about what's happening in the Amazon. You have to care about the melting of glaciers in Greenland. You have to, because eventually when those glaciers melt, as they did, over 1 billion cubic feet of ice melted in Greenland last year and is now in the Atlantic Ocean and making its way to our shores, you have to care about how interconnected we are. And so I think we're starting to penetrate that, but what we're not starting to penetrate is that while you might not be a person of color, your reality, your destiny, your ability to thrive is still connected to mine, and mine is connected to yours. And no matter what people have told you over the generations, that we're separate, that we're different, we are not different. And hopefully we all know that right now. But some people are paying a higher price, and they're paying a higher price because they've been exposed to contaminants and to chemicals and to environmental threats and to things that threaten their respiratory capacity. They've been exposed to that their whole entire lives from in utero. We did some research, we Act for Environmental Justice did some research with the Children's Environmental Health Center at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University some years ago, probably about 12, maybe 15 years ago, looking at the exposure of women and their fetuses in the South Bronx and in Harlem and in Northern Manhattan communities, what they were exposed to over the time that they were carrying their babies in utero, and what the effects would be on those babies to toxic air pollution once those babies were born. And then we followed those children not only through the pregnancy of their mothers, but also up to 24 months, and to see what the developmental impacts were on those babies. Each and every one of them had some kind of adverse impact from being exposed to toxic air pollution in utero. So it's really, really, really important that we recognize that there is a reason why some parts of our population today are being more threatened by COVID and dying at a faster rate. And I'm sorry to say that very few people have been really talking about the connection and the environmental connection to this COVID moment. But on Monday,
do you want me to bring up that map we were looking at and
yes,
talk about that a little further?
So Eliza and I were talking about this talk, and we were looking at, this is the dashboard from Prince George's, this is dashboard from Maryland of the COVID cases. And you see, so there are two places in Maryland that they have the highest rate of COVID and the highest rate of death from COVID. And it's the two places that I would least have expected in the state of Maryland. Prince George's County, where I live, has the highest rate of COVID cases, 2,035. And then the neighboring Montgomery County, which is the most affluent. So these are two of the most affluent communities in the state of Maryland. Prince George's County is the most affluent majority African-American community and majority people of color county in the United States of America, the most affluent. And the difference between the demographics, it's certainly the class demographics in Prince George's County and Baltimore City is like night and day. The only thing that we share in common is that the majority of the population is African American, but the class reality is completely different. You would expect, and not because people are poor and working class, but because people live in such a densely populated area in Baltimore City, you would expect that that would have a higher rate of COVID, as we're seeing out in New York City and some other, and Detroit and some other major metropolitan areas. But in fact, it is in Prince George's County. And so Eliza and I looked further, we looked into what's happening in those two counties. Where are the hotspots? One hotspot was Langley Park, which is a majority immigrant community. And another,
let me see if I can bring up the live map while we're going here.
And another spot was Silver Spring, Maryland. Silver Spring. We all love Silver Spring. Even those of us who don't live in Montgomery County love Silver Spring because that's where the great restaurants are. But yet it is a hotspot for COVID. And so we need to do more research. We need to do more thinking about this. But I know this as an environmentalist, as someone who has spent decades looking at the relationship between exposure to air pollution, disproportionate exposure to air pollution, and the impacts on people's quality of life, their morbidity and mortality. There is a direct correlation between a lifetime of exposure to air toxins and hazardous air pollutants and your vulnerability to COVID at this moment, and the likelihood that you might die from COVID. So I feel that in my soul. And then on Monday, a week ago Monday, the Harvard School of Public Health put out a report that said, if you have a 15% exposure to air pollution, you are more likely to develop COVID and you're more likely to die from it. Harvard School of Public Health. So, you know, if Harvard said it must be true, right? We joke about that. But truly, the Harvard School of Public Health is one of the foremost research entities, perhaps maybe not as foremost as Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. I'm just going to put that out there for those of us who live in Maryland. We love our Johns Hopkins, but they put out this study last Monday, and it completely shifted the narrative about COVID, completely shifted the narrative. So the narrative has been, we're all in this together. And I'm here to tell you, we are not all in this together. And if we are, then we better stop leaving some people behind, because we're leaving whole pockets, whole communities, whole cities are being left behind in this conversation about where the resources are being targeted, where the medical interventions are possible, where you can get tested, how you can get access to healthcare, how you can get access to ventilators. We are about to see, we haven't seen it yet, but we are about to see a tsunami move across this country as this pandemic moves into the Deep South, moves into the Plain States. The Navajo Nation has closed down. The Navajo Nation, no people are allowed to come on to the grounds of the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is the size of Connecticut. The Sioux Nation is also huge landmass. Very little public health infrastructure, very little in the way of ventilators and modern treatment that can help folk. But they are looking at the possibility. I heard the governor of New Mexico say that there's some tribal communities in New Mexico that if this pandemic reaches them, it could wipe them off the face of the earth. So I just want people to understand that in this moment, while it is a wonderful idea that we're all in this together, but we are not all experiencing this the same way. And so I would like to tweak that narrative, as a colleague of mine at Metropolitan Group has said, if we're all in this together, then we can't leave anybody behind. And we're leaving a lot of people behind. Eliza?
So how do we do that? How do we push back on these? I jump to like my academic language, these complex intersections, but it's really intersections of tragedy and intersections of grief and suffering. It's not academic at all. It's, as you said, it's numbers of funerals, it's lives. So how do we take this moment and use it? How do we build the trust and the interconnectedness that we're going to need to make everybody be together and bring each other along?
Well,
what's giving you some motivation?
The fragility of every community, no matter where you live. You can live in the highest skyscraper in New York. You can live in the most affluent part of Houston. You can live in the gated communities of Montgomery and Prince George's County. It is not going to save your ass from this. And what is going to save us is, first of all, paying attention to scientists. You know, I feel like I need to yell that at the top of my lungs for the people in the back. Pay attention to scientists who are telling us what to do, what precautions to take, and pay attention to the most vulnerable among us. So we still have, in the District of Columbia, we have an enormous homeless population. In most major metropolitan areas in the United States, we have enormous homeless populations. They don't have access to sanitation. They can't social distance. We have lots of people who live in homeless shelters. We have lots of people who do not have the most basic of necessities. This pandemic is going to devastate them. And there's no way to contain that where they are and to keep the rest of the population separate from them. So again, our common humanity, our common interconnectedness, I think as environmentalists, we have to demand of ourselves, of the institutions and organizations that we're a part of the communities that we belong to, all the associations that we have. People keep talking about, I just can't wait till we go back to normal, right? Until we get back to normal. I don't want to go back to where we were, because where we were left so many people so vulnerable, so vulnerable. I don't want to go back there. yeah, I want to go out my house again. I'd love to go further than my mailbox. Be a great thing, right? I mean, I just want to go to the supermarket. I'm not asking for a lot. But I would like to go back to work. I would like to be back in DC, one of the most vibrant, extraordinary cities in this country. I'd like to go back to the Anacostia Community Museum, whose board I serve on. We've reopened. We got new branding. We're bad, and I want to get back there. I want to go to Austin. Clean Water Action is supposed to be having a board meeting in Austin, Texas, the first weekend in June. We can't do that. That's probably when the pandemic is going to be at its zenith in Texas, is right around that time. We can't go back to where we were. We can't go back to this segmented society where some people are so destitute that they don't have homes, they don't have shelter, they don't have access to running water, or they live in tribal communities that don't have the most basic of necessities. We cannot go back to that place. We cannot, because it makes all of us vulnerable. And so I want to propose a challenge to all of us to think about, what we do differently moving forward, how we think about other people in other communities moving forward, how we think about crossing all kinds of boundaries, stepping outside of our lanes, going to places where people wouldn't expect us to show up, giving each other grace. You may not have known about some of this data that I shared with you tonight, but that doesn't mean that you don't care about it. And I will not presume that you don't care about it because you didn't know. So we can't go back. We have to go forward, and forward in a new way, forward with a new kind of thinking, and forward with, I know it's safe to presume that everybody who's listening to this video right now, to this Zoom cast right now, are voters. Well, you got to make sure everybody is a voter, because we say this all the time and it's become trite. Vote like your life depends on it. Well, your life does depend on it. And we got to show up and show out for everybody. So that's what I think we have to do different, Eliza.
Let's do it. I mean, let's do it. I take one of the things, this is a question that's not on our list, but I'll just tell you that you talked about wanting to start in the civil rights movement, and that I know you feel that you've always been a part of the civil rights movement, and that's part of what makes the environmental justice movement what it is. Mm-hmm. What can we take from the civil rights movement and its successes and build on in this moment? Maybe ones that, I know the environmental movement has a lot of debt, both explicit and implicit, to the civil rights movement in general, but is there anything that the environmental movement hasn't glommed onto yet that are tactics from the civil rights movement or strategies that we should use?
Well, I'm going to give a shout out to Clean Water Action, on whose board I serve. Clean Water Action, to my knowledge, and I can be corrected, and please correct me in the chat if I'm wrong about what I'm about to say, but I think we are the only environmental organization that still primarily does our work through grassroots mobilization, knocking on doors. That's who and what Clean Water Action is. This is a difficult moment for us because we've had to pull all our canvassers off the streets. So we don't know, what that's going to mean for us organizationally going forward. But when it's safe to go again, we will be back out there knocking on doors. There is nothing more powerful than that human connection, the mobilization of door-to-door household organizing or neighborhood organizing. We've lost that. We've gotten so sophisticated in how we organize. I'm old school in organizing. I have to knock on somebody's door. When my dear friend Donna Edwards ran for Congress here in the Maryland 4th Congressional District and got elected, I went door to door for her here in my subdivision, 550 homes, and I knocked on maybe not every door, but almost every door, and I put something in everybody's mailbox so that they could see me and develop a connection with somebody who lived where they lived, who was supporting this woman who was running to be our member of Congress. I'm old school like that. I believe in Twitter. If you know me, I'm all over Twitter all the time. I'm a Twitter organizer as well, but nothing beats grassroots mobilization. And we've gotten so sophisticated in the ways that we interact and reach out to folks that we've forgotten about the human connection. And now that we've had this COVID moment, we're going to have to figure out how to still interact with people on a human level until such time that we all know that we're safe. But we can't just rely on electronic mobilization. Though the young folks have taught us a lot, and I put Eliza in that category, about how to, mobilize in some different ways, in some different spaces. But you got to do all of that. And that's one thing that the civil rights movement did. They left no stone unturned. They mobilized in churches. They mobilized in synagogues. They mobilized on college campuses. They mobilized high school, junior high, elementary school kids. They mobilized everywhere. They mobilized in the unions. They mobilized under the professional groups of people, Black lawyers and doctors, and they mobilized everywhere. They mobilized in the North, though they were on the ground in the South. They had satellite branches that were mobilizing in other parts of the country. They linked up with the Chicano movement. They left no stone unturned in their organizing. And they made the moral question, and they challenged us all. And this is a huge moral question for our country, for our world. Are we going backwards, or are we going forwards? And so I think that's what we take from the civil rights movement, and leave no stone unturned. There's no one who can't be mobilized. There's no demographic that we shouldn't be talking to. Even the folks who we think don't agree with us, I say, let's reach out our hands. Let's knock on everybody's door. Don't say that person works for the SEC. I don't think they're going to be with us. That person works for, the National Association of Manufacturers. Let's skip their house. Let's not skip anybody's house. Let's dial every phone number. Let's make every opportunity to build common cause.
I would say, nonetheless, one of the issues that we've learned as a leader in a historic and mainstream environmental organization is that is the importance of true representation. That when you're knocking on people's doors, you want a trustworthy person to knock on their door, and especially in a community where who might have more reason to be suspicious than others, of folks who are coming in from outside their community. And so I think that speaks to a question that's been really highly ranked in our question box. I'm giving you the first audience question, which is, what's, in your opinion, why do you think environmental activism is still disproportionately underrepresented by people of color? And I'll put a twist on that from our previous conversation, which is mainstream environmental activism.
Yeah.
How do you think that we're still seeing underrepresentation there?
We are, but we're also seeing a lot of progress. So when I worked at the Natural Resources Defense Council as their first director of environmental justice, so that was 1993 to 1999, there were 5 program staff of color. Now, we held every administrative spot in the organization. I don't know what it is about the green groups and the government as well. They don't seem to think that people of color have a lot of ascendancy in terms of, promoting and ascending the ranks. But my God, we are the best typists, the best filers, the best meeting planners. We can do all of that, but we don't seem to be able to do anything other than that. So when I got to NRDC, almost all the administrative assistants were people of color in all the offices, but very, very, very few program staff were people of color. We had 2 people of color in senior management, the communications director and the director of the public health program, and I was in middle management. And the work was extraordinary. While I was at NRDC, I got to help support and work with the White House Council on Environmental Quality to write and draft the executive order on environmental justice. And I have no doubt that it was because I was at NRDC, and NRDC had a close relationship with the Clinton administration, that I had that opportunity. I got to work on a lot of great policy issues and made quite an impact, I think, while I worked at NRDC. But man, the culture inside the organization was rough as a woman of color, as a person of color. And it's a completely different organization today. There's a lot of people still there that I worked with who are still doing great work, but there's been a cultural transformation within the organization. And by that, I do not mean that the majority of the staff are people of color, but how the organization thinks about itself, how the organization thinks about interacting with diverse communities, how they represent those communities, how they build partnership and build common cause is completely different than in the time that I worked there. Earth Justice, another organization, used to be known as the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund and changed its name. When I worked at NRDC, a friend of mine, Veronica Eady, went to work at Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, and she called another great friend of mine, hero in the environmental justice movement, Miss Dana Alston. Dana passed away in 1999, but she was the environmental program officer at the Public Welfare Foundation. And when Veronica Eady called Dana Alston, she was calling around to the few people of color that she had heard of who were working in the mainstream environmental movement and asking us for advice. You know, what should I do? How can I build this program at Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund? And when she called Dana, Dana laughed so hard she dropped the phone because she just thought it was absurd that the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund was going to have an environmental justice program. Now they are known as Earth Justice. And if you could see the work that this organization is doing, both in its healthy community space, but in its air and toxics program, across the organization, food and farming, everything that they do has so much connectivity and has so many people of color working in it. I want to give a shout out to Patrice Sims, the Vice President for Litigation and the head of the Healthy Communities Program at Earth Justice. Patrice is a graduate of Howard Law School. Patrice also worked at NRDC. When Patrice worked at NRDC, he was the first attorney to have graduated from a historically Black college and university to work at the Natural Resources Defense Council. That was about 10 years ago. That wasn't a really, really, really long time ago. So we're still trying to make the organizational transformation, but it's happening. Eliza, I want to say it's really, really, really happening. I mean, look at Audubon, you know, taking nature Black. I'm just going to say, everybody who's on the call from ANS, you know about taking nature Black. But if you don't, you should go, because it's just a great event, all-day event. People are talking about issues. Folks have come from everywhere. They're honoring people. This year, they honored my dear friend Mustafa Ali and a whole bunch of other people. They honored me in 2018. I wasn't able to go, but I have my award right here in my house hanging on the wall.
That's wonderful.
The change is, it's nothing short of earth-shattering. That's not to say that there's not a long way to go. And so I want to say to the mainstream environmental organizations, it's more than lip service. It's transformation, right? We're talking about being a part of a movement that calls for social and ecological transformation. You can't transform the earth if you can't transform yourself. And so that's the first place we have to start. And once we are able to do that, then I think we'll see more success in the policy spaces that we're trying to work at. We'll see more growth and better indicators in the environmental improvements that we're trying to bring about. But first, we have to transform the organizations and the entities that we are, so that that transformation can then flow out of our organizations and impact the work that we care so deeply about.
Whew, yeah, and I'll say I added it to the chat box. Taking Nature Black, we also do Naturally Latinos, and then that will be next in 2021, date to be determined, and possibly different than usual if we don't have a vaccine yet. But for us at Audubon Naturalist Society, just to share in response to what you were saying, what we ended up doing was we had a lot of conversations at the beginning, chicken and egg. Did we need to really work on making sure that we had a diverse program staff first before we could really authentically outreach to communities that were different from the majority of our staff? Or should we just go ahead and do the outreach because we had some people who really wanted to do it and make it happen, and we thought we could make it be successful? And we just decided the answer was yes. And we did both. And we have put a lot of policies and structural changes in place to help us diversify our recruitment and hiring. But that is a long-term process. And so in the meantime, we've been able to convene these conferences that have just brought together, of course, incredible talent. And then boom, we have a new pool for recruitment purposes. So it's for us, it's really gone hand in hand, that providing these great, really authentic and community sourced with, they all have planning committees that are not just our staff, of course. Conferences brings people together in a programmatic way, so thereby fulfilling our mission, and also have given us access to expertise, committee members, task force members, advisors, speakers, staff recruits, all partners, community partners, all sorts of folks who have been fantastic partners in helping us grow our work. And you've been a great advisor to us throughout that process, so thank you.
I just want to jump in and respond to something I'm seeing in the chat. about, so Winnie raised this, my sister board member from Clean Water Action raised this issue about the leadership opportunities within the mainstream environmental movement or green groups as people of color. You see more people in staff positions, but you don't see people in leadership roles. And that still is a mountain to be ascended and to be climbed. But I'll tell you honestly and truthfully, I don't want to be the director of an organization that doesn't have a culture that embraces me, right? Embraces me in my full totality of who I am. I remember when I worked at NRDC, and don't get me wrong, I use NRDC as an example because it's the only mainstream environmental organization I ever worked for. And I worked for it for a number of years. And when I got married, half of the people who were guests at my wedding were my colleagues from NRDC. And many of the people who are some of the dearest people on this earth to me are my former colleagues at NRDC. But baby, it was not an easy place to be as a person of color who was not trying to hear, tone it down, Vernice, you need to embrace the culture. And so I learned that I did something every day that was just a flagrant violation of the culture. I had the audacity to go to people's offices and talk to them directly about whatever it was, the issue that I wanted to talk to them about, or something that somebody had called me about from around the country. And I would go to that program person and say, hey, let's have a chat about this. And apparently it was a faux pas. You don't just barge into somebody's office. You don't knock on the door. You wait. I don't know how the hell you're supposed to wait or how long you're supposed to wait, but Vernice wasn't trying to wait. I was there was a problem. Let's have a conversation. Let's resolve the issue and figure out what we're going to do to go forward so we don't keep repeating the same problem over and over. President Obama was known for having said to his staff, and I quote, let's try not to do stupid shit, right? We're going to face some complex issues, but let's try not to do stupid shit. And I thought that was my actual job description at NRDC. Let's try not to do stupid shit. Let me just go with me, right? Let's do these things and let's not do those things. When we are going to work on policy, let's talk to a variety of people, not just the people we talk to all the time, and then go over to the White House and say, we think this is what you should do. Let's see what the fullness of our community thinks about various policy directions. I have no doubt that the reason that the Waxman-Markey bill went down in flames is because they didn't talk to anybody outside of the usual suspects about what climate policy should look like, right? So the culture of our organizations says a lot about who we are and a lot about who we'd like to have in our organizations. And if we're not willing to change that culture, not just tweak it around the edges, but really fundamentally change it so all kinds of people feel good in that space, right? And I'm talking about LGBTQ people. I'm talking about people whose first language is not English. I'm talking about people who didn't go to Ivy League schools like I did. I'm talking about people who really represent the fullness and complexity of our society. Let's create space for them in our organizations. And I think our organizations will be so much more vibrant and so much more powerful as a result of that. But as I look out at the landscape, I can't think of any green group that I would want to be in leadership in until I feel that I am fully embraced in who I am in being in that space. And I think we're still working on that, but we're making a whole lot of progress, I'm here to tell you. So I don't want you all to take from this that, oh, we still have a long way to go. We do have a long way to go, but we have made so much progress. And, folks like Eliza, there's so many people, Shante Coleman, just so many young people that I know of here in the DMV who are moving this conversation so much further than it ever was. And, they come into this space differently than people in my generation came into this space, because they're not trying to hear all of this stuff about you don't belong and this is not for you and you have to do it like this. They're bringing their full complex selves into the work, and it's transforming our organizations. And I for one, applaud it wholeheartedly. Boy, that was a long answer. What the hell was the question? That was such a
I think the question had to do with representation of people of color in mainstream environmental organizations. And I think you gave us a great answer. So thank you. And it's true, it's real. I'll tell you that at Audubon Naturalist Society, we go through what are genuinely uncomfortable cultural moments all the time. And the question is, how is that going to shake out? We're just a small organization. We're not a national organization. We're trying to figure it out, and it's complicated. It's challenging to make cultural change. We are really committed to it. Our executive director is ready to say that if you're not on board, we thank you for your commitment and your service to the organization, but we are committed to inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And if you're not on board, it was nice, but that's still a very slow process. It's a slow process of cultural change.
I want to recommend a piece of work. So I think Casey Wetzel and Jana are on the phone are on the video from the Chesapeake Bay Trust. We were a part of a 5-year effort that the Chesapeake Bay Trust and the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network supported, which was like a major 5-year effort to do capacity building around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice within the watershed movement in the Chesapeake Bay region. And it was extraordinary work. It was hard. It was difficult. It was really about cultural transformation, but it was really also about getting the watershed movement in the Chesapeake Bay region to be reflective of diversity of the population of the people who live in this 11-state region, right? One of the most diverse parts of the country was not really reflected in the watershed community, and there's still work to be done. But we took a deep dive together to look at those issues. We did data analytics, we did focus groups, we did all kinds of work, conversations. We were around the Bay. We did work in West Virginia, work in Maryland, work in Baltimore City, work all over the region to really prepare people for this conversation and to move us forward as a community. It's work that I'm exceedingly proud of. I will always be proud of being associated with that work. But we also produced a report. So if you're trying to figure out what should I do, what steps should I take, how can I address this issue from the smallest volunteer organization to the largest, well-funded, well-resourced organization, we have recommendations for everybody of every size about how to really go about this work. And I just want to give a shout out.
You're talking about the DEIJ toolkit, right?
Yes, the DEIJ toolkit. And I just want to give a shout out to Casey Wetzel, who was the heart and soul of getting this work done. And we had lots of difficult conversations and lots of difficult moments, but we certainly, I think we're transformed by the work and hope that you all will utilize this report, utilize the recommendations. And we also had a lot of recommendations for funders that you can't stand on the side and watch what the grantees are doing. You have to be a part of the process, and you have to transform your own institutions, because in many ways, the funders have perpetuated this sort of segmentation of the environmental community and who gets resources and who doesn't. And so we had recommendations for both the philanthropic community as well as the watershed community itself and everybody in between. And I will forever, ever, ever, ever be proud of that work that we did. There's some, also people are listing, oh, wait. People are listing some really great publications that I want to.
Yeah, that was one of the questions, was book recommendations to read more about environmental justice. And people have been, we crowdsourced the answer to this.
Excellent. So there's some great resources that are listed here in the chat. Black Faces, White Spaces by Carolyn Finney. Oh my God, that is such an extraordinary book. Farming While Black by Leah Pennington. Did I say that Black Faces, White Spaces was by Carolyn Finney? Farming While Black by Leah Penniman. You can Google the name Bob Bullard, who is a dear friend of mine and Dr. Hollis's, Dr. Robert Bullard from Texas Southern University. Bob is the foremost author, published author in the space of environmental justice. And Bob will tell you, unless I missed out on a book, I think he has 18 books now on environmental justice. And they're all available, online. So just Google Bob and you'll see a lot of stuff. There's just lots of great stuff out there. There's a great book by, in fact, this is a pivotal book by Professor Bunyan Bryant. It's called, it's right a room away from me on my bookcase, Environmental Justice, I think. But it's like, it's really the pivotal soup to nuts textbook on environmental justice, both domestically and globally, by Dr. Bunyan Bryant. It was published in 2002, and it is the text on environmental justice, if you ask me.
So let's grab in our remaining couple of minutes, because we have 9 more minutes and I want to make sure we end promptly on time. Partly, let's be real, so that I can help put my baby to bed, I can hear them upstairs. So we have a couple last questions that are specific to some of the different stories and experiences you already brought up. And what I might do is give them to you as a list, and then you can see if there's any you'd like to provide answers to that we can wrap into a follow-up email, because I'd actually like to ask you to wrap with circling back to the bigger picture. We talked about how you talked about how we need to rise to this challenge, how we need to get out there and vote. We need to go door to door. We need to connect with people. One question that somebody asked, and I think is a good way to sort of end this, is do you think that with what we've learned about the current pandemic and the press really documenting the impact on people of color, the larger impact, do you think that that knowledge, that press, is there a shift in popular awareness that you think will have an impact on the future if we follow up with going door to door, or is it going to be a continued uphill battle?
It's going to be a continued uphill battle. There's no question about that, because for the most part, you know, this is one fundamental thing we have to recognize. We live in a highly segregated society. And by segregated, I mean racially segregated. Our kids, for the most part, don't go to the same schools. We don't shop in the same stores here in my town, and Dr. Hollis is going to laugh at this, and she knows what I'm about to say. We have 2 giant supermarkets in Bowie, Maryland. Well, one is in Mitchellville, one is in Bowie. The one that's in Mitchellville, I have always referred to as the Black Giant, because that's where the Black people shop. And the one that's in Bowie, I refer to as the White Giant, because that's where the white people shop, right? And every now and again, oh, you go to Wegmans and everybody's in Wegmans, right? But we still, even in this little town, Bowie, and you know, I'm from New York City, so it's a city of 55,000 people, is a small town to me, though we are the 4th largest city in Maryland, thank you very much. But this city was founded when it moved out of its rural background, its rural base. It used to be tobacco plantations all over the place with hundreds of slaves, owned by Ogden Bowie, the first governor of Maryland. And then it started to become suburbanized in the 50s. And it became a Levitt town. Samuel Levitt, a big developer in New York, who built all these suburban communities all over the United States. Levitt town was built as a segregated development. Every Levitt town in the United States of America is still a segregated development. Levitt town here in Bowie, Maryland is still a segregated development. Yet around it grew this extraordinarily affluent African-American community. And though we have a white population in our town, you still don't see a lot of intermingling between well-to-do Black people and middle-class white folks. So it's not about class, right? People say, you know, once you get in a space where everybody has the same economic background, things change. No, they don't. Things do not change, because in our minds, in our souls, in our psyches, we do not see each other as equal. And until we confront that most fundamental thing that separates us at the cellular level, we're going to continue to be challenged by these issues. So again, I say, you know, COVID, God knows, I wish no one in the world had experienced this. We have not seen the worst of this pandemic. We have not. This is just the first phase of coming to the shores of the United States. It hasn't really gotten to a lot of parts of the country. And when it does, they are not going to be equipped to deal with it. Rural America does not have the public health infrastructure to deal with it. And they all neglected and would not sign up for the Affordable Care Act or expansion of Medicaid, so they don't have any health insurance. How are they going to deal with this pandemic? It's going to be a tsunami when it reaches the rest of the country. So we need to steel ourselves for that. But as we're doing that, let's figure out some way to get resources to people, to open our hearts to what people are going to go through, to donate to causes that are supporting folks, to donate to our food pantries, to support churches and synagogues and mosques that are out there doing work on the front lines, to support our young people. We got to do everything that we can to show people in other parts of the country who may look differently than we do, that we care about them. And I think until we transcend that, People think we don't care about them, right? That we don't care about people in the middle of the country, and we don't care about people on the Eastern Shore, and we don't care about people in Western Maryland and West Virginia. We do. But until we can persuade people that that's true, we're going to continue to live apart. And the living apart is killing us. And so we have to do it better. We have to do it differently. And we have to confront this scourge of racial discrimination and segregation. We are still a fundamentally segregated society. My God, people have been working on this for 150 years. When are we going to let it go? When are we going to let it go? So here's one great thing, right? Last year, well, I don't know if people are paying attention to the Virginia legislature, but they are killing it in the state of Virginia. They are passing all kinds of great things. Last week, they passed one of the most expansive gun laws regulating gun use in Virginia. But one wonderful thing happened in Northern Virginia. For 15 years, Northern Virginia counties have been trying to get the name of Route 1 changed from Robert E. Lee, right, to something else, anything else but Robert E. Lee, right? And the rest of the state in the legislature would not allow them to do that. Last year, they finally won the right to change the name of Route 1 to something other than Robert E. Lee. If that's possible in Virginia, all kinds of transformation is possible. I'm just saying, right? And people worked for that. They worked on the ground for that. I know lots of young friends in Virginia who mobilized and went door to door and did all kinds of work after the Klan showed up in Charlottesville. They took their state back. And that's what we have to do.
Damn. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Wow. So, Vernice, we've come to the end of our time. The chat box has been just an incredible wealth of communication from our attendees, and I really want to thank everyone for adding. Vernice, we'll get this saved for you so you can read it all in detail later, but it's just been incredible. And I want to thank everyone for your questions. And most of all, I want to thank you, Vernice. Nobody else can applaud but me, so I'm going to applaud. And I thank you all for joining us and for being interactive in this way. And I will say that, I'm sitting in here in my basement. Human connection is hard. It's hard to do here in this virtual time. But listening to you speak and listening to your stories and hearing that history is very, very inspiring. And all our attendees, I hope you're feeling what I'm feeling, because I just wish I could leave my house and start knocking on doors. So we've recorded the whole thing, and anyone who's made a donation already, you'll be receiving the link so you can watch it as soon as it's prepared. I'll hope for early next week, but our video guy has to process it, so it might take a couple days. And then in 30 days, it'll be available for free. So it'll be available to everyone after that. And Vernice, I just can't thank you enough for doing this conversation and for all your work, and for really keeping it real in so many ways. All throughout your entire career, you've been so dedicated to this. You could say intersectionality. My boss, Lisa Alexander, doesn't like the word intersectionality, but I think that the phrase you used, that we used for our title, my survival is inextricably tied to yours. That's it. That's intersectionality. It's our survival. So thank you for coming. Thank you for bringing that to us. I'm going to encourage everyone to follow Vernice on Twitter. You can follow me too if you like, but she's far more interesting than I am. And tweet about tonight's talk. If you had a great line that you wrote down in a notebook, put it out there in the world for others to hear. And we hope you come to our next one. So our next one will also be virtual with Felipe Benitez, the executive director of Corazon Latino. And it's going to be different. All of our speakers at Conservation Café are different. They come from their own perspectives. They tell us their stories. They tell us how they're doing conservation, stewardship work, advocacy work, policy work, justice work, whatever it is. And so we have this continuing conversation going on, and we hope you'll continue to be a part of it. And with that, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vernice.
Have a great night, everybody. Be safe. We are going to get to go outside again. I promise you.
Yes. Yes, one day. All right. Well, thanks everybody again, and have a wonderful evening, and be healthy and be safe, and stay 6 feet apart from other people when you're outside exercising. And we'll see you in person one day. All right, good night. Okay, now I have to end the meeting.
Well, Miss Eliza,